Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Michelle Wells and I am the Adult Services Director for the Southeast Steuben County Library. I would like to thank the staff of the Rockwell Museum for hosting us tonight, particularly Mary Mix, Kate Swanson, Janelle Steiner, and Brett Smith for all of their help in bringing this program to fruition. The Rockwell Museum's participation is made possible in part by the Institute of Museums and Library Science. Last year, the Southeast Steuben County Library was given a bequest in memory of Keith Vaughn to create programming that educates people about the Buffalo Soldiers. I wanted to share a little bit about the person who made this gift to the community in which he lived. Keith was born in Philadelphia in 1952. He graduated from West Philadelphia High School and later earned a master's in education from Temple University. He moved to Corning in 1992 with his wife Elizabeth and went to work for Corning Inc. as director of EAP, and subsequently held many positions in human resources, training, and threat assessment. Keith was a true Renaissance man whose many passions included jazz, motorcycles, reading history, sporting clays, and Tai Chi. We remember Keith tonight by sharing his interest in the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. This bequest also funded several other programs this past year, including a poetry contest about the Buffalo Soldiers. In doing research for that program, I came across the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the 19th Museum of the Smithsonian Institution, where Dr. Salter curated an exhibition on the Buffalo Soldiers. We are very fortunate to have him here with us tonight. Dr. Salter spent 25 years on active duty in the US military, in the Army, retiring as a colonel. He is a military history and African American history historian and museum professional. Among his areas of expertise is the African American military experience. He is the author of 2 books, including The Story of Black Military Officers, 1861 to 1948, and contributing author, consultant, editor to at least 5 other books. Dr. Salter is the curator of permanent exhibitions at the Smithsonian, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Pentagon, and senior historian consultant for 2 documentaries. He currently serves as the executive director of the museums at Cantigny Park in Chicagoland, which includes the First Division Museum and the developing Robert R. McCormick Museum.
Thank you, Michelle, for that great introduction. And it is so great to be here tonight with this partnership between the Southeast Steuben County Library and the Rockwell Museum to talk about the Buffalo Soldiers. I think this grew out of an email and a conversation about 5-6 months ago. And here we are tonight. And hopefully we can share some stories that will enlighten you on the service of Buffalo Soldiers. We're going to start with the American Revolution. So the first print that you see is the gentleman on the white horse is William Washington, a distant cousin of the commander-in-chief, General George Washington. But you also see an African-American on a horse. He is an unnamed African-American, and he is credited with saving Colonel Washington's life. And this is at the Battle of Cowpens, and I'll weave in some movies every now and then. So if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, this is the closing scene, the battle that is based on double envelopment. The next vignette comes from the War of 1812. So to back up to the American Revolution, about 5,000 to 6,000 African Americans served in the colonial forces during the American Revolution. When you get to the War of 1812, there are not many African Americans serving as infantrymen on the ground, but a lot of African Americans are serving in the Navy. The Navy has about 12 to 25%, and I know that's a large range, but records were very tough to keep. And you do see that range in a lot of the historical readings. But this particular vignette is Captain Perry at the Battle of Lake Erie. And we do know the name of that African-American who was with him throughout the War of 1812. That's Cyrus Tiffany. And he is credited with saving Perry's life at least once throughout the War of 1812. The third vignette is during the Seminole Wars. And of course, these are not African Americans who fought for the nation. During the institution of slavery, we always hear about African Americans who run north to flee the institution of slavery, but a great number of them actually ran south and joined with the Seminole tribe, and they became Black Seminoles. And this is an image of John Horse, who became a warrior with the Seminoles and a tribal leader during the Second and the Third Seminole Wars. And then the last vignette I would like to talk about is the War of 1812. We often hear that African Americans were not a part, the Mexican-American War, were not a part of the Mexican-American War. But in fact, you can read the quote, and I meant to build this slide, I forgot to change it, but you already see who the quote is about. Who says it? Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, 1845. And he's writing this to Julia Dent, who was then his fiance. Of course, they subsequently marry, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm not reading the slide, but he says something to the effect that I have a Black boy who will be going with me and he speaks several languages. And so there were African Americans who ended up going to the Mexican-American War. And then there were some who were caught up in skirmishes on the border and actually in Mexico. So not recorded in history, but there was participation. And quickly, go to the next slide. So just to build a little bit on the American Civil War, this is a broadside from the collection at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's about 5 feet tall. It's a beautiful artifact to look at. And you see the unit that it was recruiting, and you see the image at the top. That's the 54th Mass. And a lot of us have seen the movie Glory, and we know about the 54 Massachusetts. But what we often don't know is the picture at the bottom. These are contraband camps. They became recruiting grounds. About 180,000 African Americans served during the American Civil War. So when you look at the picture to the top right, and I hope, okay, it's top right, that's E Company of the 4th USCT. The 54th was only one of roughly 136 infantry regiments of the USCT that fought during the American Civil War. There were a few cavalry units of African-American soldiers, and there were some artillery units of African-American soldiers during the American Civil War. So the 54th was just a small part of that service. And then when you continue on and you look at the image to the bottom right, that's David Farragut at the Battle of Mobile Bay. And you can probably, I'm afraid to move the pointer, but I'll try. The Navy, just like times of old, had African Americans mixed into the force. And so you see an African American who was ramming the guns. And he was not the only African American on that particular ship and throughout the Union Navy. And then, of course, you cannot talk about any war without the contributions of women. And so I used Susie King Taylor. We could have used many more, but Susie King Taylor is one of the good vignettes to use because she actually wrote a book about her experience. She escaped from the institution of slavery. She served with the 1st South Carolina. She was a nurse. She was a teacher. She was a laundress. And those are the things that women contributed to. And so that is the historical overview, just going up to the American Civil War. With the interest of time, we're not going to go beyond World War I, but we'll look at that. So when you get to the Buffalo Soldiers, I always try to let individuals know when you're looking at history, try not to look at it in a stovepipe. So for me, to understand the magnitude of the Buffalo Soldiers' service and the time that they served on the Western frontier, we probably need to know a little bit about the history of that era. So after the American Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was passed, ending the institution of slavery. making African Americans citizens. And then the 15th Amendment actually extended the right to vote to African American men, because all women we know don't get to vote until the 19th Amendment, although there were cases where women were voting. I'm talking about the amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1920. And this particular print has 4 vignettes. If you go clockwise, and we'll start from the right top and go down, the service of African Americans. It depicts the service of African Americans. When you go down to the bottom right, education. Many of the HBCUs that we know about today were started during this period. And then you go across the bottom and you go to the bottom left, African Americans being a part of the community and society being raised and being built. And then you go to the top, African Americans still working in the fields. And as W.E.B. Du Bois says in around the 1880s, stood a brief period in the sun and then went back to the institution of slavery. And I'm paraphrasing, because what happens is sharecropping put African Americans in another system of slavery. Also in 1877, and we talk about Henry O. Flipper when he graduates from West Point, the same year Henry O. Flipper graduates from West Point, it's the same year that on paper, and as we read it in history, the era of Reconstruction ended. But some can say that the Reconstruction period ever really ended. And then in 1883, which the first image we saw, African Americans on the Western frontier participating in the Indian Wars. By then, 7 to 8 years, we have the civil rights cases of 1883, which turns back almost all the gains from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And then when we get to 1896, and we're going to talk about one of the pictures you shared with me, when we talk about an experimentation the Buffalo Soldiers participated in, that's the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is when separate but equal was codified, not overturned until Brown versus the Board of Education. So when we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers and those gentlemen fighting for their country, doing what they did on the Western frontier, this is the America that they're participating in and living in. And so let's talk about the Buffalo Soldiers and why they are extremely important to a lot of us, and especially a person like me who served in the military. All those vignettes I talked about were, today you heard the term surge. During a war, African Americans, even during the institution of slavery, they would be impressed into the military service, or some would join the military service, as they did during the American Civil War. But as soon as that war was over, the American Revolution, the Quasi-War, the impressment wars on sea around the 1806, 1807, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and even the American Civil War, they were not kept in the Army, in the Navy. They were not a part of the military force. The Army Reorganization Act, as you see here, and you notice that the dates always seem to follow a big war. The Army Reorganization Act of 1866 is that act which made African Americans from that day until today permanent parts of the military force. That's why the Army Reorganization Act is very important. And so it established the Buffalo Soldiers, and these are the two call outs that established those units, and they're not called Buffalo Soldiers. Then the first red box pretty much says that the Army is going to grow from 6 cavalry regiments to 10 cavalry regiments. And it specifically notes that 2 of those would be men of color. 2 of those cavalry regiments will be constituted of men of color. That is where the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry were created. And then you go a little further down, that second red box, essentially what it says is that the Army is going to grow to 45 infantry regiments, and 4 of those regiments would be made up of African Americans, the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st. Now, just like today, budget cuts, the Army only grew to 25 regiments, and the 24th and the 25th regiments by 1869 became those 2 regiments of African American. And so one of the easy ways to remember how many cavalry regiments and how many infantry regiments were in the military It's the fact that the last two were African Americans, 9th and 10th, so there were 10 cavalry regiments. So when you think about it, 20% of all cavalry soldiers in the United States Army on the Western frontier and throughout America were African American. 8 and 2. And the last two infantry regiments, 24th and 25th. So about 8 to 12% of all infantry soldiers in the military were African Americans. And when you watch the movies and you see Native Americans in cavalry uniforms, some of you know, I'm telling some of you what some of you know in this area, they are cavalry soldiers. And so you also have Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. So this is where the Buffalo Soldiers, this is where they are created. And this is the actual Reorganization Act that is in the National Archives. Okay, so let's talk about the Buffalo Soldiers. We already talked about the first bullet there, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry Regiment, and the 24th and the 25th Infantry Regiments, but also there were Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, just like there were Native Americans who served in the military. There were also Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. And one of the reasons I showed John Horse, these individuals who become Seminole Negro Indian Scouts are descendants of some of those Black Seminoles who ran south to join with the Seminole Nation. So between 1866 and 1898, these men served courageously on the Western frontier in the era that I tried to paint earlier. And it's key to say Western frontier for the 9th and the 10th and the 24th and the 25th, because unlike their white brethren, it was a realization not to put an African American with authority and with weapons on the Eastern Seaboard. That's why Buffalo Soldiers served on the Western frontier. And we learned some tough lessons later on when some African American units were assigned to the Western, to the Eastern Seaboard. Not only did they participate in the Indian Wars, they also served as some of the first National Park Rangers. Now, the National Park, yes, was not established until 1916, but there were national parks that had been created. So Buffalo Soldiers had participated at some of the national parks like Yosemite, Sequoia, the Golden Gate National Park. A company later serves in Hawaii National Park in 1916, the Klondike Gold Rush Park in Alaska, and many others. They also served in the Spanish-American War, and they also served in the Philippine War, and some folks refer to it as the Philippine Insurrection. We know the story about the Buffalo Soldiers and the Rough Riders fighting intermingled during the Spanish-American War. And some of that happens during the Philippine War, and they're not only there in 1900 and 1901 to 1902, but the American force stays in the Philippines for another decade and actually on into the interwar years and throughout World War II. We have American forces there. Of course, MacArthur is a civilian commander and is brought back to active duty at the beginning of World War II. So there's a long history of Americans being there, and African Americans had been a part of that as well. And of course, looking back down on my slide, I skipped the Mexican border. But it's key that Buffalo Soldier units that not deployed during World War I. Those African Americans who deployed during World War I are volunteers and draftees, volunteers and National Guards. So the 93rd Division of African Americans is mainly made up of National Guard units. The 92nd Division is made up of draftees mainly, and we often hear the Buffalo Division. And so people are always questioning some of us who read history and think that the Buffalo Soldiers deployed during World War I, but the 92nd Division adopted that patch in homage to the Buffalo Soldiers. So the Buffalo Soldier units, the most well-trained African Americans in the military, were not a part of our American Expeditionary Force when we go into World War I. And in fact, by that time, Buffalo Soldier units from the Western frontier, and we'll talk about some of the things they did on the Western frontier and the medals of honor that they received, not only on the Western frontier, but during the Spanish-American War. They are now relegated to duties on some of the key forts: West Point, Fort Myers, Leavenworth, and the Presidio. And they were assigned at those high brass institutions because of their skills as horsemen, often played against some of the officers and cadets in sportsmanship activities. So they're still around, and the Buffalo Soldier units are not actually disbanded until post-World War II. But the Buffalo Soldier units that we know and we read about mainly and we see on TV is really kind of between 1866 and 1898 when we're talking about Buffalo Soldiers on the Western frontier and in battle. Okay, so Michelle and I were talking, and she shared some of the collection with me and said, it would be great if you could talk about, some of the Western frontier activities and some of the artwork. I'm not an art historian, but some of you will probably know the connection once I get to it. So I was given access to several of the collection prints, and this is one, cutting out a steer. And, Frederick Remington is responsible for this particular piece. And when we look at it, we see the beauty of it, those who like art. And when we read about it, I liken him and his prints to, he either drew what he wrote about or he wrote about what he drew, because you can actually see the action when you're reading. And the other thing about being on the Western frontier, what this really means to me as I studied it, is sometimes we often think that the cowboy is just targeting the easy steer. But cutting out steer is, okay, you're going to get that particular steer, whether he or she is on the end or somewhere in between. And so he's writing about the dangers and the toughness of being on the Western frontier. And he wanted to experience that before the Western frontier that he had been hearing about as a child was gone. And I'm not going to talk about how he got there and used some of his funds and his brief stay at Yale, but he does end up meeting a West Point officer in 1886 by the name Powhatan Clark. And he assigns this Buffalo Soldier first sergeant to him named Givens. And he goes out on the frontier, and the picture to our left is not his first print, but it's in the first year that he began to draw, and it appeared in Harper's Weekly, Rescue of Corporal Scott. And this is based on Powhatan Clark, and it shows some of the dangers of having to go up the rugged terrain and Buffalo soldiers being with their white officers, because there were only a few Black officers, and we'll talk about those. But the key thing about this image is when you add up the number of drawings that Remington did of soldiers, about 20% from what my research has shown in the last 2 or 3 months were of African-American soldiers. His stay with the Buffalo soldiers. And as I was looking closely at the print today, even in cutting out a steer, and I think you can see it better on this, right below his whip as he's going for some of the cattle, I'm of the belief that that's an African-American cowboy in that particular image as well. And then, of course, the image on the right talks to us visually of the terrain that not only the Buffalo soldiers had to endure, but all soldiers on the Western frontier. And he writes eloquently about how it was an art for a soldier to go up and down the side of a mountain. And this is while you are tracking Victorio and Geronimo and escorting stagecoaches across the frontier, installing telegraph wire, actually protecting some of the white settlers who later on would either befriend you or push you aside. That is the life that they experience. So these are some of the, at least two of them I know are in the collection of the Rockwell Museum. And of course, I just kind of put the cover of the Harper's Weekly at your bottom left there. Okay, so going back to the exhibition at the Smithsonian. So this is just a small part of the exhibition. We have a sweep of the entire military experience. This is the call out of the elevation that talks about the Buffalo soldiers. And so what I did is I pulled out just a few of the artifacts, and I'm going to talk about 1, 2, or 3 of them. But the one I want to talk about in the top left, looking at the time, is the officer jacket of John Hanks Alexander. I can remember when that box came in and we got to go down and open it, and it had his name written in the side of his trousers and his coat. He is the second African-American to graduate from West Point. And people always ask, as a museum professional, why do you interpret certain people and not others? Well, we interpret Henry O. Flipper in this particular interpretation, but John Hanks Alexander, who has largely been unknown, and I'll tell you why in a second, we talk about him more because we have his artifacts. To have an artifact of the second African-American to graduate from West Point and have it on display is just an awesome thing. And I talked earlier about why not have African-Americans on the Eastern Seaboard. You see that Sharp's carbine. They were soldiers, they were issued weapons. To be a Buffalo soldier, you had some level of authority, you carried a weapon, and no matter what your rank was, and most African Americans were of lower rank, but if you were a sergeant in the military, you got the same pay as a white sergeant. If you were Flipper, Alexander, or Charles Young, and I'll talk about them later, the 3 African American West Point graduates, when you were a lieutenant, a captain, and major, you got the same pay and rations as your counterpart. And the desertion rate for Buffalo soldiers were lower. And number one is because they were good professional soldiers. But number two, to be an African-American in this country in 1880 and 1890, you had less of an opportunity outside a uniform to perhaps do better than what you were doing. So to be a soldier was certainly something of pride. And because of Remington, people began to know about their existence. Before the image I showed you of 1886, there had only been 2 images of African-American soldiers in print between the American Civil War and 1886, 20 years. And then after that, there's a flood of many images of African-Americans in several print presses because of Remington. And so Remington is certainly credited with helping people understand that there are African-Americans on the Western frontier. And he wrote about them not in a degrading way. Now, when you look at some of the writings today, we may not write it like that today, but I have not seen any derogatory words that he used or language such as others did. But nonetheless, Remington is certainly a credit to putting them on the map during that era. Okay, and so their prowess on the battlefield. Look at how many medals of honors were awarded to African Americans. We're not even talking about the 26 that were awarded to African Americans during the American Civil War, but people often say that there were 18 medals of honors awarded to African Americans on the Western frontier. That's true, but only 14 were awarded to African American Buffalo Soldiers because the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, the other 4 were awarded to Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. And you can see that there were also another 6 medals of honor, where there's only 5 on here. There was a Navy, but there were also medals of honor awarded during the Spanish-American War. And actually, I didn't put those on this slide today for this particular presentation, but let's talk about a few. Just gonna call out a few. And the reason we're gonna look at these individuals, number one, we don't have pictures of everyone. But number two, just to kind of give you an understanding. So the guy in the top left, that is Pompey Factor. He is one of the 4 Seminole Negro Indian Scouts to be awarded a Medal of Honor on the Western frontier in 1875 for deeds, marching all night and engaging in battle the next morning. The next 2, Jordan and Woods, are a part of the 10th Cavalry, the 9th Cavalry Regiment. All but one, if you remember from the previous slide, medals of honor awarded to African Americans were awarded to 9th Cavalry. And these are 2 of the individuals that were awarded the medals of honor. The 10th Cavalry Medal of Honor recipient is McBryar. And when you look at him, you notice something a little different about his uniform. You do see the officer shoulder boards, because although he was awarded his Medal of Honor in 1890, he was an enlisted soldier, but he did earn and receive a commission during the Spanish-American War and also served in the Philippine insurrection. So when you think about the 1890s and the 1880s and you go into the 1910s, you had African Americans who had been 3 war veterans: the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the Philippine insurrection. They had contributed to the development of this country as soldiers and been a part of the regular army. And so I'm gonna try to get through these next 3 slides in the next 4 minutes, because I do like to take Q&A and leave some time. So these are the 3 men that I spoke about who were the only African-American officers of Buffalo Soldier units on the Western frontier. There are 2 officers that come later on, John Green and Benjamin O. Davis Sr. But these are the 3 African-Americans who graduated from West Point. Henry O. Flipper, 1877. John Hanks Alexander, who we have some of his artifacts on display at the Smithsonian in 1887, 10 years later. And Charles Young, who graduated 2 years after John Hanks Alexander in 1889. This is certainly a feat, ladies and gentlemen, to achieve, because for all cadets who went to West Point, whether you were white or Black or a part of another ethnic group, the attrition rate was huge. And for these men to survive that ordeal, and they were silenced and ostracized, not because they committed some egregious offense, which caused white cadets to be ostracized. They were ostracized because they were African Americans. So of the 27 African Americans that were appointed to West Point during this period, 12 actually entered, and these are the only 3 that graduated. Unfortunately, Henry O. Flipper's career was only 5 years. He was drummed out of the force in 1882. Maybe we can talk about that later. John Hanks Alexander, we don't know an awful lot about him because he died on active duty while he was a professor of military science at Wilberforce University in 1894. And he was shortly thereafter replaced by the only other officer that could have taken that job, Charles Young. Wilberforce is an HBCU. Actually, Wilberforce was established prior, to be exact, It was established prior to the Civil War being established. So we may talk about that later on as well. So he replaced John Hanks Alexander, and Charles Young is the only one that made it through a full career in the military, and he retires, he dies on active duty as a colonel in 1922 overseas as an attaché after having been denied a chance to lead African-American soldiers in World War I. And he was diagnosed, he had been put on the promotion list. He was diagnosed with Bright's disease, and so he was retired, but he was brought back on active duty on November 5th, 1918. That's 6 days before the armistice. So there was no chance for him to perhaps be promoted to general officer. And recently, of course, he was just posthumously promoted to general officer. And his house is the National Park Service in Ohio, Wilberforce, Ohio, not too far from here. And I've had the opportunity to go there several times. And when Charles Young graduated, and this is the context of history and another discussion I have, the next African-American to graduate from West Point does not graduate until 1936. That's Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who is the son of Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who was mentored by Charles Young when he was taking his officer's test around 1899, 1901. And so the first two African-Americans to reach general officer in history, and I'm going a little bit off of the Buffalo Soldier, are father and son, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and Benjamin O. Davis Jr. And so coming up to my second to the last slide, this is another image. Well, can you talk about this image? Do you know about this image? And when I got it, I just kind of smiled because obviously I do know about this image, have written about it, and people see it. African-Americans were a part of several experimentations during their career. In the museum, I was in the military, as some of you know, so we have these mittens, these cold weather mittens. The Buffalo Soldiers were a part of the experimentation. We have some of those mittens back from the 1880s, but they were also, the Army was looking into an alternative mode of transportation besides the horses. When we get back to the Western frontier, there was a lot of care and feeding. It was a lot to take care of the horse. And soldiers took care of those horses because if they did not, they were going to have a tough time in battle. And that was their closest friend for most of them. And the bicycle was cheaper. You didn't have to feed it. You didn't have to do an awful lot to it. And then, of course, could it get infantrymen somewhere faster? So when you see this image, this is actually one day of a 41-day ride that started in Missoula, Montana, and ended in St. Louis. And what year was that? 1896, the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson. And so for me, as a military historian, as an African-American historian, and I merge those two together, I always study their experience and other ethnic groups in the experience of what's going on in America. And of course, made it a lot slower and a lot harder if they were on horses, but about 3 times faster than an infantry unit would have gotten there. The unit was disbanded 2 years ago. The Army did not adopt that mode of transportation. And I forgot to mention, I didn't talk about the Buffalo Soldier robe that you saw. We have one of those on display. The Army toyed with purchasing those in 1869, but they did not adopt those. But a lot of the soldiers purchased those because they were warm. So when you see a cavalry soldier or an infantry soldier on the Western frontier with a buffalo robe, he's out of uniform, but hey, he was trying to keep warm. And so the last slide, we talked about the Park Service. The gentleman in the center, and hopefully the slide won't jump, that's Charles Young. So he's still in the Army in 1903. Like I said, he dies on active duty in 1922, January of 1922 in Liberia. He is at Sequoia. I've actually been on that exact spot, and he takes 3 officers and 93 soldiers out to Sequoia National Park, and they build roads and trails and make sure that the trees, the great monuments to our nation, are not being cut down, and they are protecting against poachers. And the Army did that for several years, different units, white and black units. And they stayed pretty much at the Presidio, and they went out there in the spring and stayed all summer and into the fall. And when it got winter, they came back. But that's Charles Young, and that's one of his duties. And Charles Young spends time during this Philippine War in the Philippines. He's also on the Mexican border. And as I said, he did not get to serve overseas during World War I. He was temporarily retired. But that brings us to Q&A. Tried to get through as much as I could in a short amount of time. And so ready to take some Q&A.
I'm going to help out with this, so because we have people that are on Zoom as well. Are there any questions in the live audience right now?
So for the American Revolution, were the African Americans active duty soldiers or other?
No, go ahead.
So during the American Revolution, were the soldiers active duty or other roles?
They were in other roles. So when you say active duty, there were not a lot of white soldiers who were active duty. The Army was small. There were a lot of militia units. So none of the African Americans would have been quote unquote African Americans. Some of them were free, and they actually joined in the North, especially the Connecticut units and the Rhode Island units, and they were actually integrated. The American Revolution had integrated forces, but there were also a great number of African Americans who were impressed into service to serve for their white owner or to replace a son in service. And the other thing about African Americans who served during the American Revolution is the fact that a lot of them were promised their freedom, and a lot of them did receive their freedom, but there are some African Americans who served and fought and then were put back into the institution of slavery. And the other thing I'll say in closing, I try to keep my answers short, but more African Americans actually served for the British forces during the American Revolution. One of the things we talk about when we talk about African American service, they were fighting for the side that offered them the best chance at freedom. And so when you have Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment and you have other forces who are promising your freedom to serve, you are going to serve. And that's why you have African Americans in Nova Scotia today. The British, I think it was about 5,000 or 6,000 that they actually kept their promise, and they gave them their freedom, and they went to Nova Scotia.
Okay, I'm going to try to do a back and forth here so that, we get to everybody. So the question on Zoom is a little bit relevant. What happened to those soldiers? Let me take this off also, by the way.
Okay.
What happened to those soldiers that served within the US and didn't go overseas after they were discharged? Do we have history or records of how they influenced society or what became of them?
What era are we talking about?
Yes. What
Must be
era?
World War I. The soldiers who served in the military but did not go overseas.
I would say that the question is probably for any of the wars that you named up into.
Okay, so it would have to be the Spanish-American War and forward. So here I go using some of the military terms. We have this term called power projection. So the Spanish-American War was our first power projection war where we are not fighting on this country, but we are power projecting our force overseas, and the same with World War I. So some of those soldiers who fight in the Spanish-American War, all Buffalo Soldiers unit went, the 9th, the 10th, the 24th, and the 25th, so they stayed in. But there were state militia units that went, and those soldiers, when they came back, they stayed in their state militia. As a matter of fact, at the 1st Division Museum in Chicagoland, we know about the 369th Infantry Regiment. There was also a 370th Infantry Regiment, which is born out of the 8th Illinois. Those soldiers were National Guard soldiers. They came back and they stayed in. But there were some soldiers who were so bitter about the way they were treated in World War I that they got out and actually threw their medals away and their uniforms away. And after World War I, a lot of African Americans were forced to suppress the fact that they served, especially if you were in the South. That would cost you your life if you were an African American walking around in your uniform. And just one last vignette, because this is why I like Q&A, because the presentations kind of put me in a rote mode. But there's a guy named Charles Houston. I love this guy. People know him as a lawyer. But he actually became a lawyer because of his service in World War I. His father was a lawyer, wanted him to be a lawyer. He wasn't going to be a lawyer, but when he was treated the way he was treated in World War I, he came back and decided that what happened to him and what he saw happen to African Americans in World War I was not going to happen again. There's a lot of history, but to make a long story short, he is the same Charles Hamilton Houston that is the architect of Howard Law School, who trained about 1/3 of the active lawyers of African descent in America in 1940. And who was one of those lawyers? Thurgood Marshall, Brown versus the Board of Education. And Charles Hamilton Houston was not the only African American that did something like that, that changed history.
Well, that was a great question.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really important answer.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Okay, we take from our slide.
Yeah, I'm interested in your acquisition process, or how do you come about acquiring pieces either for the museum or an exhibition?
Okay.
Let me just repeat that for our, this is silly, but just for the people at home. So what's the acquisition process for the museums that you work with for artifacts?
It's a team effort, and museum folks here, a lot of us as curators, we know that there's something out there and we will actively pursue it. But a lot of artifacts, someone knows that they have this artifact that may resonate. And I'll just give you the vignette for the African American community is no one was really asking. No one was really asking. And my teammates that I had the honor to serve with at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, led by great leaders, they made a conscious effort not to borrow artifacts from other Smithsonians because they felt and they knew that those artifacts were out there, and they started this treasure program. And when African Americans realized that someone wanted their artifacts, they would write in. So we would get leads and we would also chase leads. And I did that and my colleagues did that. I had 2 more vignettes in my mind, I could say, but I want to give more people to ask questions.
Well, we'll see. We might have time.
Yeah.
I bet the folks here will hang out too.
Okay.
Can you speak to Kathy or Cathay? I'm not sure the pronunciation, but Kathy Williams enlisted in Buffalo Soldier.
Cathay Williams, absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So she, we talk about women. So she is the only known woman who served as a Buffalo soldier. And I think she was in the 38th. So this is the 38th Infantry Regiment. Remember, there were 4 regiments named. And so for the first 3 years, they were still on paper before they came to 24th and the 25th. So yeah, she disguised herself as a man. And I don't think she served for more than a year, but she ended up going to the infirmary and she was discovered to be a woman. But as a military historian, people say, man, that's unusual. But women have been disguising themselves for centuries before that. And Cathay Williams was not the first African-American. Now that we know, there is a book called They Fought Like Demons. I have so many of these in my head. I think I got the right book. It's about women in the American Civil War. Is that the right one? They Fought Like Demons. There are 3 named African-American women who disguised themselves during the American Civil War. So that's who Cathay Williams was. And there is a monument to her out in Leavenworth, Kansas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me scan my slide as well. Yes, sir. Here, let me get closer.
Did any of the Buffalo soldiers serve custard?
Did any of the Buffalo soldiers serve with Custer?
Okay, and we actually rehearsed this. This is
Yeah.
the hybrid.
Yeah.
I could repeat them, but this is the model, and Kate and I rehearsed this. They did not serve with custard, but there were Buffalo soldiers that came were coming to the aid of Custer's unit at Little Bighorn. So let me try to truncate this. So we have to go beyond serving with Custer. So the answer is no, because he commanded the 7th Cavalry. And a part of the reason he was in the 7th Cavalry was he had actually been offered to be a lieutenant in one of the Buffalo Soldier units. And so he declined, like a lot of white officers did. So no, Buffalo Soldiers did not serve with Custer, but often on the Western frontier, there would be companies and troops when you're talking about cavalry, companies when you're talking about the infantry, that were out on raids and patrols together. So no, they were not in his unit, but Custer would have been familiar and been on a trail with other Buffalo Soldier units in certain cases.
I think this is going to be the last one. We do have a couple of closing remarks.
Okay,
this
great.
is going to be our last question. And the question is, why was Henry Flipper removed from his commission? Do we know that?
Yes, we do. So Henry Flipper was independently wealthy during that time. He was the first African-American to graduate from West Point. He wrote 2 books. He wrote about his cadet experience. He was paid quite well, handsomely for that. He also wrote about his experience on the Western frontier. Well, Flipper had developed a friendship with the daughter of his wife, and they just kind of rode together. And so some other officers, as the story goes, got a little jealous. Some money was stolen. He was the commissary officer. Money was stolen from his chest, and he, claimed that he did not take the money, and he knew he did not take the money. He was brought up on charges, and so Flipper replaced the money. That's why I had to say he was independently wealthy, to give himself time to uncover the plot. To make a long story short, it was found out that Henry did not embezzle the money, but because he lied to his commanding officers, he was discharged for actions unbecoming. And there are folks who have written about other actions of other officers on the Western frontier who did acts more egregious than what Flipper did and got less than being discharged. And I think it was in 1977, I forget the years, there's a lot of years up there, but he was eventually exonerated. He spent the rest of his life doing that. I know I'm talking too long, but he's a great story. He's my hero. I went to Florida State University, my graduate degrees, and so he's from Thomasville, Georgia, so it was 30 miles across the border. And I did my dissertation in my book on Black military officers. My chapter 3 and 4 are about these 3 men. And so when he died in 1940 in Atlanta, the rest of his life, he was successful the rest of his life. He always defended himself. And unfortunately, the reason why we don't have any artifacts of Henry O. Flipper, the way the story goes, and I've gotten this from several folks, and I've been to the great museum that in Thomasville that tells his story, is when he died in 1940, all of his belongings were put on the curbside and went somewhere. And so we have never found any artifacts associated with Henry O. Flipper.
Wow. Again, what a good thing someone asked that question, right?
Yes, I like the Q&A better because, I kind of get in the rote thing. There's a lot of stories we can tell. So I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me.